For the last 3 years, our convention scripture texts have reminded our diocesan household of our connection to salvation history. The life of our diocesan household reminds me of the holy scrappiness of the Israelites gathered at the water gate, begging Ezra to read scripture as they stood for hours and hours and listened to their identity being reflected back to them in the sacred text of their faith. They had worked hard to rebuild the physical walls, and now they listened intently to rebuild their spiritual walls. We too have that scrappiness as we faced our challenges, come together to create and adopt the Thrive recommendations, strengthened our ministry, endured a pandemic and historic flooding, all while contending with the sea change in organized religion in our culture. I cannot count the times people across our diocese have told me they are stepping out of the boat in stormy waters, not in search of adventure, but because they understand taking a risk, trying something new is an act of going closer to Jesus. People have said, "Oh, Bishop, we're stepping out of the boat, going closer to Jesus." We see ourselves in this story on a local and diocesan level. We have stepped out in faith, asking God to help us to try new ways of being church, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with doubt, and often with a measure of fear. We can truly say that we can see the power of God working in us is abundantly amazing and transformational. Following convention, even though I love these passages, we will move on to a new scriptural focus for our work. But I pray that we will carry what we've learned from Peter and Jesus, from the scripture that has shaped and encouraged us over these 3 years. They have been a grace to us these 3 years. And in years to come, we can count on these passages to continue speaking to us. So for today, let's stay for a while with the disciples, Peter, Jesus, the boat, the wind, and the waves. As Matthew wrote this gospel, the imagery of a boat tossed in a storm was an important symbol for the early church. It illustrated their experience of life as people of faith, as followers of Jesus. Matthew presented the expectation that the church will always be tossed about by the waves and storms of the world. Likewise, we will always have Jesus reminding us to stay focused on him, even as we acknowledge the fear or hesitation that accompanies our faith, which needs to be strengthened. Looking out on the horizon of the wind and waves, the disciples could see Jesus, but he came to them in an unexpected way. And trying to make sense of his appearance, walking on water, they likened his presence as something harmful, a ghost. And like the disciples in the storm-tossed boat, we may not always welcome the ways Jesus comes to us, because Jesus challenges our notions of what we expect. Imagine us trying to tell Jesus what to do. We must be careful not to dismiss new opportunities he presents and label them as something malignant. The boat held the disciples in all their uncertainties and vacillating faith. While it was a refuge, it could not keep them from noticing the danger all around them. Just recently, John the Baptizer had been beheaded, so I'm sure they didn't want to face losing another important person. And I'm sure, I guarantee you, it's not in there. You can go look, but it's not. But I guarantee you, someone, if not several disciples, told Peter, "Sit down. Don't get out of the boat. Don't get out. Stop." I imagine they also feared the implications of Peter getting out of the boat. It probably wasn't a tiny boat, so Peter might not have done much to upset the equilibrium of the boat, but he would upset the equilibrium of the shared work of keeping the boat afloat and moving through dicey water. Of course, if Peter got out of the boat, would they too be expected to show the same courage? Peter, the rock on whom the church is built, is a sign of who we are called to be and how to act in faith. Peter had to get out of the boat in order to engage in a mission that took him closer to Jesus. And thank God for Peter's example of mustard seed faith, always relying on Jesus to perfect and mature his faith. He shows us what a life of faith looks like. It is not perfect. It has room for growth, and always, always, always turns to Jesus as a focus and place from which to gain direction, strength, and salvation. If it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Think about that statement. Peter has every confidence that Jesus has command of creation. Every confidence. As he looked out at the figure on the stormy waters, Peter was seeking proof that the figure he was seeing was actually Jesus. He knew Jesus was capable of walking on water. Remember, he said, if it is you, if it is you. Then Peter takes the initiative when he says, command me to come to you on water. Peter asked Jesus to empower him to do something he could never do on his own. Besides stirring up a longing to follow him, Jesus did not initiate Peter's walk on the water. Peter did. Remember, Peter asked. Peter decided he needed to do something he had never done before, so he asked Jesus to make it possible. He knew he needed to do something, and that was go towards Jesus. He asked Jesus to empower him to do something. Peter trusted Jesus had the power to make him do what only God can do. Peter's mission at that moment was about Jesus' power to move him. And once Peter began to walk on the water, of course, fear of sinking, fear of failure, the waves and wind began to distract him from the bold attempt he was trying to make. And when he became afraid, instead of abandoning the mission and getting back in the boat, because he could have just simply done that, instead of stopping what he was doing, Peter called out to Jesus, "Save me, save me." My friends, going towards Jesus is not an action without risk. It is something we can do. It is something, not something, I should say. It is not something we can do without fear. I know you've heard me say before, I don't know why Jesus and angels and all those things say, oh, don't be afraid. We're people, and we will be afraid, and it's okay to be afraid. This doesn't have to stop us. My friends, going towards Jesus is not an action without risk. It is not something we can do without fear. We can learn from Peter's confidence in Jesus' power to make him the disciple he hoped to be. He shows us that it is all right to have fear, while we also know that we are called to do something unexpected and that requires us to embrace change. And I wonder, how would we approach ministry and our life of faith if our ritual around baptism were not so tame? Our baptismal fonts aren't as deep or tumultuous as that stormy sea Peter ventured out onto. When we think of baptismal waters, we are aware of the transformation they hold, but rarely do we consider the risks of a baptismal life. Peter walking to meet Jesus on the water reminds us of the power of water. As our state has lived through destructive flooding, many know firsthand that water can also bring with it loss, danger, disruption, and uncertainty. Communities are still rebuilding after the floods of this summer. Likewise, the cleanup and rebuilding that began and continues is through the efforts of communities and neighbors, far and near, coming to help because there's no way the work could be done without the help of others. And Peter only succeeded in his mission to be where Jesus was because he relied on Jesus' help as he took a risk. Our baptismal lives really are meant to be as much a risk. Later on in the day, we will renew our baptismal vows. And one of the most essential part of those vows is the statement that we say, I will with God's help. Now, this is not a throwaway response. This has deep meaning. It is a bold statement. We don't say, I'm going to do what I do in the church and ministry and in life and in the world through hard work and by my own means. That's not what we say. Often what we do, but that's not what we've said we're going to do. And what's more, if we only do the things that are easy and feel good, why would we need God's help? I will repeat. Going towards Jesus is not an action without risk. It is not something we can do without fear. So what do we do when we're afraid and have doubts? When we hesitate to stay with the mission of going closer to Jesus? The church will always be faced with challenges, but we want smooth sailing. We want control of everything, others, situations, nature, and even God. We don't trust God to save us from the storms of life. Today's church, not unlike the early church, is in a time of significant change. Many people remember what they feel with the glory days of the church, a time when things were more certain, a time when there were more people in our pews, more young people and children. While managing aging buildings in need of repair, faithful, gifted, aging members in need of rest can't help but long for a younger generation to come alongside them and love what they love and care for. This has not gone the way people planned it. As with life, nothing is or stays the same. None of us is the same age today as we were yesterday, or for that matter, the same age we were just a minute ago. We have changed. The church has changed. Our world has changed. But we live in the world that God still calls us to minister to. And change brings along with it grief over letting go of what we've known, letting go of relying solely on our own understanding and uncertainty, or actually thinking that we have certainty, which all translates into doubt that we should do anything that makes us or anyone else uncomfortable. Our human nature tells us to avoid these things at all costs, even though our faith says this is why we must trust in Jesus to save us from missing out on who we are called to be and the ministry he calls us to share with each other. Life post-pandemic, in a time of church decline, is just another instance of the winds and waves that torment the church as we navigate life in this world. Acknowledged or not, change is what we must face. Whatever we do in ministry is about Jesus' power working in us to carry out his mission. And fear may come alongside us and distract us from the mission, but that does not mean we should abandon it. So much of God's mission is about change. Now, as we continue to live into the future, we will be met with continued challenges, And we know what to do with our fears about change. We know that seeking the comfort of what we've always known, i.e., relying on our own help, is working against our call to be the church today. We must continue to step out of the boat and walk closer to Jesus. When we falter, and believe me, we will falter, have doubts and experience fear, and when that happens, we must cry out and ask Jesus to save us. I pray that we will look to our sacred text to strengthen, guide, and remind us of who and whose we are. May our ministry be bold enough that it requires us to rely on Jesus. And like Peter, may we expect God's power to work in and through us in infinitely astounding ways. May we live courageously, knowing that we can meet the challenges ahead of us if we keep our eyes on Jesus.